Welcome to Pint-Sized History. In this video, we'll be counting down the top 10 most gruesome forms of execution in history. We'll explore the brutal methods used by ancient civilizations and rulers to punish their enemies and instill fear in their subjects. So, buckle up and prepare to be shocked by the horrors of the past in our countdown of the top 10 most gruesome forms of execution in history. Beheading is one of the oldest and most widespread forms of execution in human history. Throughout time, many societies have used beheading as a means of punishment for various crimes. The practice of beheading dates back to ancient times, with early examples of beheading found in ancient Greece and Rome. In the medieval period, beheading became a common method of execution across Europe. It was often reserved for the nobility or those deemed to have committed particularly heinous crimes. Beheading was generally considered to be a quick and relatively painless form of execution, with death occurring almost immediately after the head was removed from the body. However, this was not always the case, and some forms of beheading were incredibly brutal and painful. This form of punishment is closely tied to the figure of the executioner, a person whose profession was to carry out death sentences. In medieval Europe, the executioner was a despised and outcast figure in society. They were often forced to live in the outskirts of towns and cities and were shunned by the general public. Executioners were also often responsible for carrying out other forms of punishment, such as flogging, branding, and even amputation. The role of the executioner was an important one, and executioners were often appointed by the ruling authorities of the church. They were required to follow a strict set of rules and protocols when carrying out an execution, and were often accompanied by other officials, such as a priest, doctor, and a clerk. In many cases, the executioner was also responsible for maintaining the execution equipment, such as the guillotine, axe, or sword. They were required to keep the equipment in good working order and to ensure that the execution was carried out quickly and effectively. One of the most well-known forms of beheading is through the use of the guillotine. This machine was invented in the late 18th century and was used extensively during the French Revolution. It was also used in other countries such as Germany, Switzerland, and Sweden up until the mid-20th century. As mentioned, the guillotine became notorious during the French Revolution, as it was used to execute thousands of people, including some of the most famous figures in French history, King Louis XVI being the most notable. Coming in at number 9, it's the act of being buried alive. This punishment can be traced back to ancient China. The Chinese used this form of execution for thousands of years. In ancient China, being buried alive was considered a particularly shameful and dishonorable punishment, and it was often reserved for the most serious of crimes. In ancient Rome, this was also used as a punishment, although it was generally reserved for slaves. In medieval Europe, being buried alive was used as a punishment for heretics, witches, and other undesirables. Live burial continued into modern times. In the 19th century, for example, there were reports of people being buried alive in Africa and other parts of the world. It was also used as a form of punishment for certain crimes in some parts of the United States during the 19th century. The experience of being buried alive would likely involve a feeling of complete helplessness and despair. The person being buried alive would likely feel trapped and unable to move or breathe, which would lead to a sense of panic and terror. The complete darkness and lack of air would also be disorienting and disconcerting. As time passed, the person would likely experience a range of physical sensations, such as a lack of oxygen, extreme thirst, and hunger. The person would likely feel increasingly weak and disoriented as their body began to shut down, taking hours to die. Coming in at number 8, it's death by elephant. Using elephants as a form of execution dates back to ancient times in South and Southeast Asia. It was later adopted by the Persians and eventually spread to the Roman Empire and the Ottoman Empire. The offending person would typically be tied to a stake or a tree with their limbs stretched out to prevent them from moving. The elephant would then be brought in and trained to trample the person to death. This could involve the elephant stepping on the person's limbs or chest, or using its trunk or tusks to crush the person's skull or other body parts. The execution would often be carried out in public as a warning to others, as the sight of a person being killed by an elephant would have been a gruesome and terrifying spectacle, likely designed to instill fear and prevent others from committing similar crimes. At number 7, being flayed alive. The practice of flaying can be found in archaeological sites in Egypt and South America. It was used in various cultures as a form of punishment for crimes such as murder, treason, or rebellion. One of the most well-known examples of flaying was the punishment inflicted by the Aztecs. The Aztecs believed that the removal of a person's skin would release their spirit, allowing it to live on in the afterlife. As such, flaying was often carried out as a part of religious ceremonies or sacrifices. In medieval Europe, flaying was often used as a form of torture, with prisoners being subjected to the excruciating pain of having their skin peeled off their body. This was often done in public also, as a warning to others. At number 6, it's being boiled alive. This practice involves submerging a person into boiling liquid, often water, but also oil or tar. It was used by the Persians, Greeks, and Romans as a means of executing criminals and political dissidents. Yet again, we come back to medieval Europe, where this was also a common form of punishment. Again, for crimes ranging from treason and witchcraft. The person being executed would be stripped of their clothes and then slowly lowered into the boiling liquid, usually with the aid of a hook or a crane. This process could take several hours, during which the person would suffer extreme pain. In this instance, the main cause of death would usually be from complete and utter shock or organ failure. Coming in at number 5, it's the Brazen Bowl. The Brazen Bowl was a brutal form of punishment and torture used in ancient Greece. It was essentially a large metal statue of a bull, hollowed out with a door on one side. The person to be punished would be locked inside the bull, and a fire would be set underneath it. As the metal heated up, the person inside would slowly be roasted alive. The Brazen Bowl was designed to amplify the sound of a person's screams, which would come out of a series of tubes and be heard as the roar of the bull. It was definitely gruesome and a very terrifying punishment, and it was designed to both physically and mentally torture the person inside. According to legend, the Brazen Bowl was invented by a man called Parellos of Athens. Parellos was a bronze worker. and he proposed the Brazen Bowl to the tyrant Phalaris as a means of executing criminals. However, after Parellus demonstrated the device on a criminal, Phalaris himself was so disturbed by the Brazen Bowl that he ordered the inventor to be put inside it himself and roasted alive. The Brazen Bowl was eventually banned in ancient Greece due to its extreme cruelty, although it remains a haunting reminder of the brutal and violent nature of human society throughout the past. At number 4, it's the Blood Eagle. The Blood Eagle is a gruesome form of execution that is often associated with Viking culture. It involves cutting open the victim's back, breaking their ribs, and pulling their lungs out through the wounds to create the shape of an eagle. The victim would often die during the process, but if they survived, they would be left to die a slow and painful death. The Blood Eagle is believed to have been a form of punishment for crimes such as treason, murder, or violating the sanctity of a Viking burial site. It was also seen as a way to gain glory and honour for the executioner, who was often a skilled warrior. Despite its association with Viking culture, however, there is little actual concrete evidence that the Blood Eagle was really used as a form of execution. The practice is primarily mentioned in literary sources and sagas, which were often embellished for dramatic effect. However, the Blood Eagle has become a popular and enduring image of Viking brutality in popular culture. At number 3, it's death by rat. Death by rat torture is a gruesome form of execution that was used mostly in medieval Europe and Asia. It involved trapping a live rat inside a container or a cage and placing it on the victim's stomach or chest. The container was then heated, which would force the rat to burrow through the victim's flesh in order to escape. The technique was often used to extract confessions or punish individuals suspected of crime. One of the most famous cases of death by rat torture is that of the English Catholic priest Edmund Campion, who was accused of treason during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. He was subjected to what was then called at the time the rack and the rats. Of course, the rats were placed on his chest, the cage was heated, and the rats began to burrow within his flesh. He endured, however, and despite the torture, Campion refused to confess. He was eventually executed. At number 2, it's crucifixion. Crucifixion is a method of execution in which the victim is either nailed or tied to a wooden cross and left to hang until they die. The practice was used by many cultures, including the Persians, Carthaginians, and Romans. In ancient Rome, crucifixion was a common form of punishment for slaves, rebels, and other criminals. It was a brutal and humiliating form of execution designed to be a public spectacle. The condemned person was typically stripped of their clothing, flogged, and then made to carry the crossbeam of the cross to the place of execution. Once there, they were nailed or tied to the cross and left to hang until they died, which could take several days. Crucifixion was a slow and painful death, as the victim would slowly suffocate as they were unable to support their weight, and their breathing became more and more difficult. In some cases, the legs of the victim would be broken in order to hasten their death. Despite its brutal nature, crucifixion was seen as an effective form of punishment and a deterrent. Finally, at number 1, and in my opinion, the worst form of execution, it's impalement. This gruesome form of execution, in which a sharpened stake is driven through the victim's body, typically through the anus and out through the mouth, chest or neck, is a practice which has been used throughout history by various cultures, including the Persians, Greeks and Romans, but it's most commonly associated with the reign of Vlad the Impaler, the infamous ruler of Wallachia in the 15th century. Vlad was known for his brutal and sadistic methods of punishment, and impalement was his preferred method of execution. He believed that it was an effective way to instill fear in his enemies and deter others from opposing him. According to accounts from the time, he would go on to impale thousands of people and at the time leave their bodies on display for weeks on end as a warning to others. The practice of impalement was not limited to Vlad the Impaler. It was used in many other cultures, one of which being the Mongols during their conquests, and also by the Ottoman Empire during the reign of Mehmed II. Dying from impalement was an excruciating and gruesome experience. The stake would typically be inserted through the anus, as mentioned before, and slowly pushed up through the body until it emerged from the mouth, chest or neck. The process, taking several hours, would have the victim experience intense pain and suffering throughout as the stake moved through the body. It would damage internal organs and cause severe internal bleeding. It would cause pressure on the lungs and the diaphragm, which would make it difficult to breathe, and the victim would likely suffocate as their lung capacity was reduced. The pressure on the heart could also cause cardiac arrest, leading to a quicker death. The process of impalement was often slow and deliberate, designed to maximize the victim's suffering and strike the fear of God into others. And there we have it, the top 10 most brutal forms of execution in history. What do you think? Did we leave anything out that you would deem noteworthy of being added to the list? Let us know in the comments. Also, don't forget to like, share and subscribe for notifications on any of our new videos.